ครับสวัสดีครับทุกคน Hello everyone. My name is Natwood Pautwi. I am a professor of behavioral science here at Warwick Business School. Welcome to our second interview with an international speaker. And today we're very lucky to have one of the most, well, I would say well-known economists that I was here in the UK. So here we have Tim Harford. So before I let me give you a formal introduction to Tim. It's quite a long credential. So Tim is a senior columnist at the Financial Times and the presenter of Radio 4's More or Less, the iTunes topping series, 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy, and a new podcast, Cautionary Tales. He's the author of many best-selling books, including The Undercover Economist, Adapt, Messy, and the Next 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy. Tim has spoken at TED, PopTech, and the Sydney Opera House. He is an associate member of Nuffield College, Oxford, and an honorary fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. Tim was made an OBE for services to improving economic understanding in the New Year Honours of 2019. Welcome, Tim. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on the, what should we call it? The show, the live stream, the program?
Live stream, the clubhouse. Yeah. Well, Nudge Thailand's kind of a, we're trying to do this for especially the Thai audience that a lot of people probably hadn't had the opportunity to meet or to ask questions, the international renowned people in either the field of behavioral science, psychology, or economics. And I guess you would classify yourself as an economist, I should say. Yep.
Yeah, I'm trained as an economist. Yeah.
So normally, well, first of all, how are you, Tim? How are you coping? How's your family?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's very kind of you to ask. This is the first day of the UK emerging from our big winter lockdown. So the schools reopened today. My children went back to school today. And so it's been a very tough few months here in the UK. A lot of people have died from coronavirus, many of them very recently, just the last few weeks. But we're lucky enough to have some vaccines now and death rates coming down quite quickly. So there is the prospect of things improving. So thank you for asking. All is well.
I should say that even although we are broadcasting as Nudge Thailand, both of us are actually in the UK because I'm also from Warwick. And I'm very glad to say that, very happy to see the vaccines kind of started rolling out now. I think about 21 million people here have been vaccinated. Okay, so today, I guess we would like to talk to you or hear you talk about your latest book, which is called How to Make the World Add Up.
How to Make the World Add Up in the UK.
Yep.
And in the US, exactly the same book is called The Data Detective, just to make things confusing. So The Data Detective in the US, How to Make the World Add Up in the UK. And they're both books about how to think clearly. Well, you could say they're books about how to think clearly about statistics, but I think really they're books about how to think clearly, full stop. And statistics are just part of that story.
That's perfect. But before we get to the detail, and I love the book, and I should say that I'm also an economist, and I love statistics, and it kind of helped me either confirming lots of the things that I had kind of been thinking about, but lots of new information as well. But as a tradition for Nudge Thailand, we tend to start with a speed round of questions just to break the ice.
Sure.
So first question, tea or coffee in the morning?
Coffee.
Coffee, oh, okay. Like Dan Gilbert.
You seem very surprised at that.
Well, I thought
I'm English.
Brit.
I'm English, yeah. No, coffee for me, thank you very much.
Okay. Would you, well, since you've only been to Thailand once, I guess, I'm not sure if this question would be relevant, but would you rather spend time in Bangkok or in Chiang Mai? Now, if you don't know what Chiang Mai is, it's north of Thailand. And,
well, there's a very good, I know I'm revealing the British experience of Thailand in my answer, but there's actually a wonderful restaurant in the center of Oxford called the Chiang Mai Kitchen, which serves excellent Thai food. And in fact, I think the best restaurant in Oxford and my favorite restaurant is called Ollie's Thai. So also
perfect.
serves Thai food. But so I've never been to Bangkok. I've only seen the inside of the airport. I'm immediately I recognize the cuisine from Chiang Mai.
Yep.
And so that's what attracts me. But this is the basis. I suspect I love cities. When I travel, I do love to see the cities. So I suspect I would find Bangkok fascinating, actually.
Perfect. Well, we'd love to have you there. I'm sure many listeners here would love to have you there as well at some point. Okay, next question is, would you rather meet your favorite author or musician?
Oh, good question. Well, I'm lucky enough that I have met several of my favorite authors. I haven't met many of my favorite musicians, although I did have the chance to interview Brian Eno for one of my books, Messy. So I would say I would rather meet my favorite musician simply because I'm so lucky that I get. So, for example, I've several times met Steve Levitt, the author of Freakonomics, met Malcolm Gladwell several times. I've had the opportunity to interview Michael Lewis, Richard Thaler. So a lot of the people in my field who I really respect and are doing absolutely tremendous work, Daniel Kahneman. So just for a change, I'd like to meet the musician. Although the truth is, I have a lot more to talk about with the authors, I suspect.
Of course, yes. Thank you for that. Okay, would you rather interview Joe Biden or Donald Trump?
Joe Biden, I think. I'm
less calm. I'm more calm.
I like calm. I'm not too fond of confrontation. And I think Joe Biden, I would want to be talking about policy ideas. And I think Joe Biden would be a person who would, be able to engage on that level. And Donald Trump may or may not be able to talk about policy ideas, but he certainly doesn't like talking about policy ideas. So Joe Biden.
Thank you. And the last question before we get to the book, how to lie with statistics or how to make the world add up?
Well, how to make the world add up is in many ways an antidote to how to lie with statistics. At least that's how it's written. It's a very good question. It invites a longer answer. Do you want the long answer?
Maybe we can get into the book then in that case, because I know that in the introduction you talked a lot about Darrell Huff's How to Lie with Statistics. And of course, like you said, and I guess that's why I asked this, I'm asking this question, because it kind of leads nicely to the book. So maybe I could lead this off to you, and if you can tell us, for the people who haven't read the book and who's looking forward to reading the book, what is its premises and what inspire you, and how does it link with How to Lie with Statistics, which many people already know?
Yeah, so I know How to Lie with Statistics very well. It's a book I read as a teenage nerd, book about numbers, and Darrell Huff wrote it in 1954, published it in 1954, and it's a wonderful little book showing all of the ways that statistics can be used to fool us. So just to give you a flavor of the book, which is full of cartoons and kind of jokes and fun examples. So Huff is able to prove that storks deliver babies using statistics. So I can give you, and this topic has been revisited actually. There's a peer-reviewed paper, Storks Deliver Babies, P equals 0.008. And those of you who've done any statistics or econometrics will know that all of those, the 0.00, all of that is saying this is not a coincidence. There's a huge relationship between storks and babies. So what's going on there? Well, there is the theory that where do babies come from? The answer is they're brought by the stork. The stork, this great big bird, flies in and delivers the baby. And this is what my mother used to tell me. I'm the oldest of 4 children. So whenever one of my little sisters was born, I'd ask where this baby came from, and my mother would say the stork. And it turns out you can prove this statistically. What you do is, so for example, you take the number of babies born in every country in Europe, and you look at the population of storks in every country in Europe, plot them on a graph, and you'll see this very strong correlation. Countries with lots of babies have lots of storks. Countries with not many babies have not many storks. And it's, the data is right there in the data. There's no arguing with the data. So the question is, what's going on there? And the answer is, well, it's to do with the size of the country. So a big place like Germany has lots of room for babies, lots of room for storks. A tiny place like Monaco or the Vatican City with Luxembourg. These are small, small countries, no room for babies, no room for storks. And that's all there is to it. So How to Lie with Statistics is a book that's full of these examples. What worries me is that cumulatively, when you read all of these great examples, you get to drawing a conclusion, which is that lying with statistics is all that anybody ever does. It's more like stage magic. Like, sure, it's fun to spot how the magician does the trick, but if you ever take any of it seriously, you're making a terrible mistake. And of course, we should take some statistics seriously, because statistics give us a window onto the world. They can show us all sorts of things we can't possibly see in any other way. And in the introduction to How to Make the World Add Up, I point out that the very same year that Darrell Huff published How to Lie with Statistics, which, by the way, is the best-selling book ever written about statistics, the very same year he published that book, two British epidemiologists, Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill, used statistics to demonstrate conclusively that smoking cigarettes dramatically increases your risk of cancer. So this is not like a stage magic. This is an incredibly important finding for human well-being and health. It saved, I think, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of lives were saved by this piece of statistics. So we can't just dismiss it as a joke. And in the book, I point out that Darrell Huff ended up working as a lobbyist for the tobacco companies, because they found this kind of style of his, which seems really, really clever, but actually gets you to the situation where you're like, well, you can't really believe anything. They found that very, very useful. And he actually testified in Congress using the storks and babies example, that he said the relationship between storks and babies is very similar to the relationship between cigarettes and cancer. So that's why I view How to Make the World Add Up as an antidote, because I'm saying, yes, statistics can be used to tell lies, of course, but they can also be used to tell the truth or to see the truth. And if we are too cynical and we reject them too quickly, that's actually worse, potentially, than accepting them all the time.
Well, it kind of reminds me, sorry to interrupt, because when I first started doing my PhD in economics, and as you know, I was supervised by Andrew Oswald, who's my colleague now. And there is this obsession within economics about causality. Right? And you mentioned a little bit about that in your book as well. And Andrew always told me that if we only believe that causality is the only thing that matters, there would be so many deaths from smoking, because nobody could really prove causally, as far as I know, because it would be very unethical to do so, to get people to randomly smoke. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it depends what you mean by prove. So Ronald Fisher, one of the great statisticians of the 20th century, was never happy with the level of proof provided. He always thought that the case against cigarettes was unproven. But there are certain things that you can look at. So you go, okay, well, what would the alternative be? So the alternative would be there's some kind of genetic disposition that predisposes us to cancer and also predisposes us to smoke. It's not so plausible, really, but possibly. Or Fisher had this idea that maybe lung cancer irritated your throat and people would smoke to ease that. But again, not very plausible, because the smoking tended to start 20 years before the lung cancer.
Yes.
So, which goes to show you how desperate he was to kind of cast doubt on the evidence. And I think it's no coincidence that Fisher was a heavy smoker. And one of the things I discuss in the book is that our own preconceptions and what we would really want to be true are, even if we're very, very well qualified, even if we're, unimpeachable experts, we can still fool ourselves because we really want to reach a certain conclusion. And I think Fisher was in that circumstance.
Yep. And just to add to that, Tim, and I guess we could talk a little bit about your first chapter as well, which I liked. And that is, well, I should say that in the book, Tim has outlined 10 rules, right? Very, very neat rules, and one bonus rule as well, but I will not spoil it if I can. But the first chapter which I liked a lot, and that is to do with what you just said about if you were to take on the opposite side as somebody who smokes and trying to find evidence to back up why smoking doesn't cause cancer. And that is what we call in psychology or behavioral sciences motivated reasoning. And I was wondering whether you could expand on this and tell the audience what it is.
So my motivated reasoning is basically going through the evidence with the hope of reaching a particular conclusion. And you can do that consciously. So for example, if you're in a debating team or you're a barrister, you're a political speechwriter, you're looking at the data, you're looking at the logic with the explicit aim of reaching a particular conclusion. You don't write a speech for a politician starting from a totally open-minded point of view where you go, well, I don't know what conclusion we're going to reach. You're aiming for a conclusion, and that's fine. I think it's understandable. But a lot of motivated reasoning is completely subconscious. So the fact that everyone seems to be convinced that the referee is always biased against their team, always, no matter who they're playing, who the referee is. It's just the power of reaching the kind of conclusions you want to reach. And there's some really fun examples of this. So one that I discuss in the book is an experiment where people were shown evidence that coffee consumption increased the risk of breast cancer.
It's a different one. Sorry.
Yeah. So there are several, but the coffee consumption increases the risk of breast cancer in women. And women who drank a lot of coffee thought this was clearly fake news, whereas everybody else found it perfectly plausible. And we're all like that. We're all striving to reach particular conclusions. And one of the interesting things that I describe in the book is that expertise doesn't really help. In fact, it can potentially make things worse. If you're really set on reaching a conclusion, being an expert just gives you more quivers in your arrow, so to speak. There's more ammunition to help you hit the target you want to hit. And the story I tell in the book is of a very respected art expert falling for a really poor quality forgery, and all of the different things he saw in this forgery that you or I would never see in a million years, but he could see. And for them, they were proof that this was a real Vermeer. You or I would look at it and go, doesn't really look like a Vermeer though, does it? It's not very good. So his expertise wasn't helping. And that's a really important idea. And another idea that I set out really in the introduction to the book is that this motivated reasoning can be particularly powerful when we're in a very skeptical mindset. So when we're trying to find reasons to disbelieve. And I think when we think about the world at the moment, we're very worried about people believing stuff they shouldn't believe. But actually, I think people disbelieving stuff they shouldn't disbelieve is important. If you think about, for example, the people who think that coronavirus isn't real, you think about the people who think climate change isn't real, or, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, think about the conspiracy theorists who thought that Donald Trump was going to be installed, the first genuine president of the US since 1873, and this was going to happen on the 4th of March. Like, what? Didn't happen. And you would say, well, how credulous, how gullible would you have to be to believe that? But for me, that sort of conspiracy theory is all about disbelief. What do you have to disbelieve to believe that Donald Trump was going to be inaugurated on the 4th of March? You have to disbelieve all the mainstream media sources. You have to disbelieve the election result. You have to disbelieve the judiciary. It's a lot of stuff. You've got to be able to find it in your heart to ignore before you can get around to the business of believing that Donald Trump's still the president. And this is why I focus on doubt as well as on belief. And I'm just as worried about motivated doubt as I am about motivated belief.
That's great. And I know that, I don't know if you know this, Tim, but Thailand is probably one of the countries that, one of the most heavily used in terms of Facebook, social media, and a lot of information that we get. I guess it's linked to your book somewhat, because in your book, you say that now we have a lot of information freely available to us. But I think, and I think it's a bit like in the UK as well, when Brexit happened, I didn't expect it, because looking around, none of my friends wanted to vote leave. So it was really unexpected for me, but in reality, I guess this is similar to motivated reasoning somewhat, or confirmation bias. I mean, what do you think about it?
Yeah, we're hugely influenced by what our friends think and what the media sources that we pay attention to, we tend to trust. We're very influenced by that. So you can misjudge certain things, like you can misjudge the result of an election because you go, well, I don't know anyone who voted for Brexit. Well, how could there's a rumor. So I'm in sort of central North Oxford. So this is all, Remain central. No one I know voted for Brexit. So there's a rumor that the father of one of the kids who's a friend of my daughter, people do say that he voted for Brexit. But I have asked his wife, and she's like, no, he didn't. And I suspect he did, and now doesn't want to admit it because there's this social pressure. And one of the points I make in the book is that actually, for a lot of things, you think about something like Brexit, there's 40 million voters in the UK, and no single voter is going to make the difference. Even though it was quite close, there was still, 1.5 million, I think, gap between the people who voted to leave and the people who voted to remain. Or you think about climate change. Your individual actions, unless you happen to either be the president of the United States or the premier of China, your individual actions aren't going to make any difference to climate change. So actually, in terms of the impact on yourself, what matters from a purely selfish point of view is social acceptance. Do my friends accept the kind of things that I believe? Do I fit in?
Yeah.
And I think there was an interesting theory. I think it's a bit speculative, but I think it's plausible that actually a lot of human cognition, particularly what Daniel Kahneman would call the system 2 cognition, the kind of effortful processing of information, is actually designed to win friends and influence people. It was never designed to actually come up with any correct factual statements about the world. It was all about fitting in. That's probably slightly overplaying it, but it is true. If you were to, Nick, if you were to have been a passionate Brexiter surrounded by Remainers, would have made zero difference to whether Brexit happened, but would have made a lot of difference to your life and how many people were willing to be your friend. So that's something to be always on the lookout for. We're very, very influenced by what everyone else thinks. Right?
Yes. And so thank you very much for that. And it kind of tells me a lot about how our emotions are involved in the way we interpret statistics. But let me shift the focus a little bit and move on to some of the rules that you've made here.
Yeah.
One of the things that we talked about a lot now, not only in the academic world, but also in the private sector, is big data.
Yeah.
And you talked a lot about big data in your, I think, the rule 7, demand transparency when computer says no.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you can tell us about, can we actually trust big data? What are the things that we need to worry about?
Yeah. So what was a real eye-opening moment for me is I realized there's a 17th century monk who I think had all the essential principles pinned down for thinking about big data. And his name was Marin Sen. And he was a French monk, and his nickname was the postbox of Europe, because all of the scientists all over Europe would send their ideas to him, and he would kind of copy them out, and he'd share ideas, he'd forward messages between, and these are people like Descartes and Robert Boyle and so on. They're all sort of sending ideas to and from Mersenne. And the point here is that there's this culture of sharing, collaborating, transparency, replication going on in science in the 1650s, 1660s, 1670s. And that's curious because at the same time, you've also got alchemy. So these are the guys who were trying to turn lead into gold and find the elixir of eternal youth. One of the points I make in the book is they never got anywhere with alchemy. It never really led to anything. Despite the fact they used the experimental method, despite the fact these were very smart people. These are people like Isaac Newton. I mean, Isaac Newton was a formidable alchemist. No progress whatsoever. And you would think, well, hang on, really smart people using the experimental method, even if it's, okay, it's impossible to turn lead into gold, fine. But your experiments are surely going to produce some kind of information, some sort of knowledge. But they never did. And the reason is because no one ever told anybody anything about what they were doing. It was all secret. And the reason it was secret is because why would you tell anybody the secret of turning lead into gold? If you do, then gold becomes, as any economist will tell you, gold becomes worth the same as lead, right? So it's not very helpful. Probably worth less than lead, in fact, because it's probably a less useful metal. So these norms of transparency, of sharing what you're doing, are incredibly important. And that's why science advanced and alchemy didn't. Okay, so now let's think about big data and algorithms. And the basic idea here is you've got huge data sets. Often there's sort of the digital exhaust that is being created by our web browsing habits, by our smartphones, sometimes from administrative data. So for example, if you have a Netflix account, just all the stuff that you tell Netflix about yourself and where you are, that Netflix is using just to run your account, that's data too. Governments have administrative data. All this data is there, and you feed it into a pattern recognizing algorithm, and it produces insights. It says, well, look, people who like to watch this TV show also like to watch this TV show. Or to a more consequential prediction, when people are searching for these symptoms, then 1 week later, diagnosis of flu increases in the same area. So maybe we can make a forecast of local outbreaks of flu from looking at the symptoms. People are trying to do this with COVID now. So somebody tracked Amazon reviews. Turns out people complaining that perfumed candles on Amazon don't smell properly tracks COVID cases. Because people lose their sense of smell when they have COVID. So it's all super interesting, but some of this stuff is used for very consequential decisions. So in the UK, the promise was that an algorithm was going to assign exam grades because the schools were shut down, the exams were cancelled. What exam grades do kids get? And the government's like, don't worry, we've got an algorithm. Yeah, maybe. That didn't work out so well. Or people who are accused of a crime, do they go to prison while they await trial, or do they get released on bail? And algorithms now advise judges about these decisions. What worries me is not that the algorithm is inherently bad. There's no reason to believe that. They can make very smart discernments that humans would struggle to make. It's not that the algorithm is biased. Algorithms can be biased, but so can humans. Algorithms will probably be less noisy than humans. There's less variance in their judgments. But deep down, what worries me is there's no oversight of this. There's no transparency. There's no learning. A lot of companies are putting algorithms on the market, and they're convincing governments to use the algorithms, and we've got no evaluation of whether the algorithm works. And that's a big concern. There's a story, fun story, which I think is in the book about a really bad algorithm having good results. So this was David Spiegelhalter, who's one of the UK's foremost statisticians, told me about this example. He was testing in the early 1980s an algorithm that was supposed to help doctors diagnose lower abdominal pain, which could be a symptom of appendicitis. It could be a symptom of pregnancy. I mean, it could mean a lot of things. And so this is a clunky old algorithm. It's not designed with the modern pattern recognition methods. It's like a flow chart, and it runs on a really old computer, and it's really hard to implement, to input all the data, and the predictions it makes are really bad. But when they did a randomized trial, some doctors use it, some doctors don't use it. The patients had better outcomes if the doctors used the bad algorithm on the clunky computer. And the reason is because it just prompted them to consider various different options and helped structure their thinking. So that's why you need a proper randomized trial, rather than just saying, well, somebody told me this algorithm would work, and so I believe them.
So it is not that algorithm, or that we should ignore algorithm, is that to understand it properly, to make it more transparent. And I think that's a really key message now, because especially in Thailand, there's a lot of talk, and we like to jump on the bandwagon somewhat with the world. But
we all like that.
Yes, I guess we all like that. And I can see that, but there's no talk about what is it that is predicting. And one thing that I like from your book is the example of how I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that an algorithm is almost perfect at telling which is a wolf and which is a husky.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, I don't know actually. Yeah, maybe you can tell that.
No, it's a great little story. I've seen it various places. I can't remember where I originally got it, but so there's a picture recognition algorithms where you show an algorithm a photo of a dog and you say this is a dog. You show it a photo of a wolf and you say this is a wolf. You show it a photo of a dog. You say this is a dog. You show it a photo of a wolf. You say this is a wolf. You do that for a while. The algorithm is learning, and then after a while, it gets to be very, very good. So it can identify the difference between huskies and wolves, which are, they're very similar looking creatures. But it turns out that all the photos of huskies are taken in domestic settings, and all the photos of wolves are taken with snow in the backdrop. And it turns out that the algorithm is spotting the snow. And of course, so you think, oh, this is joking, the algorithm's cheating. But actually, maybe the algorithm's not cheating. So a computer scientist gave me an example of his daughter, who was like 3, outside her playgroup, saw this Alsatian or sort of German Shepherd or a husky, something that looked a lot like a wolf, this big dog, comes past. And she told her father, oh, it's a dog. And her father said, how do you know it's not a wolf? And the little child said, because it had a collar. And yeah, so that's how humans tell the difference between. We're picking up a lot of context as well, just like the machines. By the way, wonderful example I saw. This isn't in the book, sadly, because I saw it just this week. Exclusive. But was going around on Twitter. Somebody's figured out a way to fool these picture classifying algorithms. So you show it a picture of an apple and you say, what is it? And the algorithm will say 99% chance it's a Granny Smith apple, 0.5% chance it's an iPod, whatever, and you say, okay, so it's successfully predicted that it's an apple. So the question is, how do you convince it it's actually an iPod? You want to guess? How do you convince it? It's a photo of an apple. How do you persuade the computer that it's actually a photo of an iPod?
No, how?
Okay, pencil, paper, you write iPod, and you stick it in front of the apple. And the computer goes, completely correctly, the computer goes, you know what? Every time I see a photo of something with a label, just read the label. Don't look at the photo, just read the label. And so it's reading the label and it goes, well, it says iPod. Of course, a human would not be fooled by this.
Yes.
But the computer correctly is saying, every single time I see a photo with a label, the label is accurate. So you can that's how you hack it.
Now that is really scary, I think. In many ways.
Yeah, well, it's scary. The thing is, it's not scary if people understand this and if the algorithms are being, checked and you just you pay attention. It's the moment that you hand the algorithm over to a non-accountable process. So, for example, you start saying we're gonna decide whether to send people to prison or not, because the algorithm will decide whether people get a job or not. We'll decide what exam grades they get, and there's no oversight. Then you have a problem, because very, very quickly the algorithm will start making mistakes that we humans make mistakes all the time, but the algorithm will make mistakes that we humans regard as unacceptable.
Yep. Sounds like a nice cautionary tale for your podcast as well, actually.
Yeah, no, that's definitely. So people should check out the podcast Cautionary Tales if they want to hear more.
Yeah, I know that we've got maybe about 5 or 10 minutes remaining. I just wanted to ask you just one more thing about one of your rules, and then we'll turn to the audience.
Sure. I've thought, by the way, I've thought of a way to summarize the entire message of the book.
Oh, right.
With if that helps, in a neat package.
Okay, great. But I'm going to ask you one more thing, and maybe you could summarize the book for us.
Sure.
Yeah. So just one more thing that I like, and maybe you can expand a little bit, and then you can conclude the book for us, is that we've got a lot of psychologists, students who study psychology out there, and you wrote about Stanley Milgram's experiment, which is the obedience experiment, and you found that, if the people don't know about this experiment, is where you put a learner and a teacher into a different room, and I think the teacher has to ask basically the Confederate in the other room questions, and if the person got it wrong, they get this electric shock, and then people keep pressing this electric shock just because somebody behind them with a lab coat tell them to do so. And it's such a huge and such a famous experiment, and lots of people, even in Thailand, know that experiment very well. But you have a very different story about that. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, well, I've got a number of different stories about that experiment. I'm not sure which one you want, but the
I guess a gender thing. I guess I was looking.
Yeah,
for,
no, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say, which different story did I tell in the book? So, by the way, people who are interested in this experiment, I strongly recommend a book called I think it's called Inside the Shock Machine, or Behind the Shock Machine, something like that, by Gina Perry. Very good book where she really picks apart all of the different things that Milgram found, and the way that story has been distorted and exaggerated over and over again over the years, because it's not as simple as the story we tell. But the point I wanted to make in the book was a very simple point, which is that every single one of the people in that experiment was a man. The actors were men, the experimenter was a man, and all of the subjects who conformed to the instructions they were given, they were all men as well. Now, why is that okay? How can you, I mean, I understand why an American psychologist in the early 1960s might focus on Americans. That's fine. Okay. You know, it would be complicated to go and get people from Nigeria and people from Thailand and people from Russia all to participate in this experiment. But there doesn't seem to be any excuse for not including any women at all. And it turns out he's not the only one. So Solomon Asch, who was Milgram's teacher, he did a very famous, sometimes called the conformity experiment. Very, very interesting experiment. I love Solomon Asch's work, so interesting. But it's all men. And he even taught at a co-educational college. So it's not even like he said, well, look, I just recruited the students and the students were all men because it was an all-male college. Not even true. He was at Swarthmore, I think, which is a co-educational college and always has been. So one of the points I'm making here is that we're sometimes looking at a very biased sample of humanity for no good reason, and it's often not discussed. I have often talked about Milgram's experiments. I have often talked about Solomon Asch's experiments, and there's no reason why these men should have used only men in their experiments and then drawn some universal conclusion about human nature. Can I tell you about the sildenafil? Have we got time to talk about sildenafil?
Yes, of course we do. Yeah,
it's fun. So I heard this from Caroline Criado Perez, who's written a wonderful, wonderful book called Invisible Women, which I very much recommend to all geeks, all about gender biases in the way we think about data. But she told me that so when this drug sildenafil was first tested, the idea is it would treat heart pain, chest pain, by helping deconstrict our blood vessels. And it turns out not to be very effective on this, but it has the side effect of giving men magnificent erections.
Yes.
So when Pfizer tested this out, they discovered, oh, hang on, we just discovered an erectile dysfunction drug. This is incredibly profitable. So they rebranded it as Viagra, and it was the absolute blockbuster drug, incredibly successful product. You know, it works, and also people are willing to pay a lot of money for it. So it's great. We're just now beginning to realize that maybe it's also a very effective treatment for menstrual cramps, for period pain, which is very debilitating, very painful experience for a lot of women, I'm told. Obviously I don't know, but I'm told it's a big problem, really affects people's quality of life, really affects people's happiness. And apparently sildenafil, Viagra, might be a very effective treatment. But we don't know because no one's ever really done a good study. And the original study where they accidentally discovered it worked for erectile dysfunction had no women in. So women never had the opportunity to accidentally discover that this is a good treatment for period pain. So the men got their accidental discovery and the women never did. So there's something, you know, you really need to pay attention to who is in this data set that you're looking at. You can tell yourself it's universal in some way. And there's almost always somebody missing. And it's worth thinking about who that person is.
I think that's a good lesson for all of us. And I guess it kind of sums up, and I would like to hear your summary of your book, your neat summary as well. And,
Sure.
and I'm sure this kind of entice people to really want to go out and buy the book. I actually bought it in Audible and listened to you speaking, which is quite nice.
It's the first
Wow.
book I've recorded as an audiobook.
Really
all
nice.
the others have been read by actors, and I thought this one felt important.
You should do this
so
often.
Well, it takes a long time, but I'm proud of the result. So the book, as you say, has got 10 rules plus the bonus golden rule at the end. But to really summarize my advice in a nutshell, when you're looking at media, social media, when you're trying to evaluate a statistical claim, the 3 C's. So calm, context, curiosity. The first one, calm. So many social media posts, so many newspaper headlines, they're designed to make us feel strong emotions. And as we've discussed, that's not good for clear thinking. So by all means, feel the emotion, anger, joy, fear, but notice it, count to 2, a moment of calm, then go back and have another look before you hit share or like on Facebook, before you tell anybody. Just look again when you're feeling calmer.
Yep.
The second piece of advice, context. So context is all of these different questions you might ask that basically say, is the number big or small? Is the number going up or down? How did they find this? Who says so? Is there a comparison I can make with some other number that makes this number have more, just more understandable? Do I know what they were measuring? All statistics are you're counting or you're measuring something. So do I know what their definition was? All of these things fall under the realm of context, and you can have a completely accurate number and be completely misled by it because you don't understand the context. So the 3 C's, calm, context, and the third one is curiosity. And curiosity is just a state of mind that says, look, these statistics are an opportunity for me to learn about the world. They are not a weapon that I can use to prove to my friends or my girlfriend or my boyfriend or my parents or some person on Twitter or Facebook. They're not a weapon to prove that I'm right and they're wrong. They're not a weapon in a political argument. If you use them that way, you're making yourself stupider. Instead, approach them with a spirit of curiosity, be open to surprises, be skeptical but not cynical, and just say, well, what can I learn from this? So the 3 C's, calm, context, curiosity, and you're well on the way to being smarter about the world.
That's perfect. 3 is the magic number. Thank you. 3 C's the magic number. Thank you so much, Tim. And I hope you're able to stay just 1 or 2 minutes longer after we end the live, so because myself and the team would like to thank you more properly. But let's turn to the audience now. Do we have any questions from the audience, guys? I don't know how you're going to put it up for us. Let's see. Is it coming? Oh, there you go. So we have here, let me see, I'll read it out. Okay, with the potential bias in the data in famous experiments, is there any key findings that may need to be revisited or could have a different result if the samples are more diversified? Of course, I guess maybe, other experiments, not just the Milgram and the conformity experiment.
Yeah, so I mean, the conformity experiments are interesting because probably the way that Solomon Asch did those experiments minimized conformity, in fact, because there were, with all Americans, and Americans, it turns out, are less conformist than many cultures. And they're all men. Turns out that it makes a difference if you have women in the experiment. It makes a difference if you have different cultures in the experiment. On the other hand, most people exaggerate the conformity seen in those experiments. So the way they're often reported in textbooks suggests that people conformed all the time. Like they would say things that were clearly untrue just to fit in with the group. And that was never what Solomon Asch felt. So I don't know if that particular experiment needs changing. But another one that I discuss in the book, and this is not an example of bias. It's not an example of bias in the experiment, an example of bias in publication. It's a very famous experiment studying choice and the impact of choice. So this was people getting samples of jam, fancy jam in a supermarket, tasting the jam, and then they get a voucher. And the question is, do they go and buy jam? And the researchers, very well-respected, serious researchers, Mark Lepper and Sheena Iyengar, found that if the display of jam had lots and lots of different types of jam, people wouldn't go and they wouldn't buy a type of jam. Whereas if the display was much simpler and had fewer types of jam, people were very likely to go and buy jam. So this was a very famous result because it was kind of counterintuitive. It didn't make sense in terms of economic theory, but at the same time, people were like, oh yeah, that does kind of make sense. That might be true. This idea that if you simplify and offer fewer choices, people are more attracted. And if you offer too many choices, people don't like it. It turns out that psychologists have run this kind of experiment over and over and over again. And the Lepper Iyengar study is an outlier. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying you look at all the different experiments that have been run. The typical one says it doesn't make much difference. Like there's 20 types of jam, there's 5 types of jam. It doesn't, you know, what really matters is, do people like the jam? I mean, it doesn't make a difference. Some find that people really like lots of choice.
Yep.
Some people find people hate the choice, and most of those big ones find it doesn't really make a huge difference. But it was the initial experiment because it was so surprising and kind of fresh. That got the TED Talks, the books, the NPR shows, that got all the attention. Yeah. And a point I would make in the book is everything that we see is filtered through the publication process, through the sharing algorithms, through just sheer interestingness. Like, do I remember it and tell you about it, or do I forget it because it's boring? And that the interestingness filter can lead us to systematically misunderstand the world.
And I think that point, the example you raised about Jam's experiment really applied in academia as well, because we now have a reproducibility crisis in psychological science. And yeah, and it kind of, you know, to be able to publish in science, you need to find a surprising result. And I get rejected a lot of the time just because the results weren't surprising.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was one of the main criteria.
Yeah. You would have thought true would be your first test. Yeah. You know, true's the first thing. Then, you know, of some practical significance is the second test, and then surprising. Well, that's nice.
It's nice.
But, you know, so yeah, it's really important. And there are lots and lots of examples of publication bias that I discuss in the book. And people do sometimes talk about a crisis. I think that things have improved a lot in the last few years. Psychologists have really started to pay attention to this. It's not just psychology. I think the most spectacular examples have been in psychology, but it's true in economics. It's true in medicine. It really matters in medicine that we kind of the studies proving that the drugs don't seem to work. They tend to disappear, and the studies proving that they do work, they tend to be, you know, there's a lot going on there, but we are addressing it. I think the situation is not perfect at all, but is improving.
I completely agree. Okay, so we got the next question. In the real world, we cannot access all data source. How do we separate the one that we should trust from the one we should not?
Well, I would refer back to the calm, context, and curiosity. So if a data source is, so I'm looking at something in a media report, for example, or a social media post, is the journalist helping me be calm? Or are they trying to wind me up? Are they trying to get me excited? Are they giving me the context? So the first thing is like, give me the link. Like, can you link me to the original source? Can you explain the significance of the source? Can you explain the methods? Can you explain the definitions? If you're doing all of these things, because I don't have time to do this for every statistic, no one has time, but I can observe, is the source that I'm looking at giving me that sort of information? Are they giving me that context? And that really helps. I mean, I think of it, a straightforward and useful heuristic is if something is published in a high quality newspaper or on a high quality website, and we all know what the high quality newspapers are. This is not a mystery. Like where they have a reputation for being right and for publishing corrections when they're wrong. That's a good start. And if it's just some piece of text that's been turned into a graphic with like a funny meme and it's being shared on Facebook and there's no source at all, mean, doesn't that worry you a little? It worries me.
Yeah.
One of the things, by the way, about social media, I don't believe in demonizing social media, but if you think about those 3 C's, the calm, context, and curiosity, a lot of social media is not helpful for that because it strips information of context, and often stuff gets shared because it's exciting, upsetting. So it's not good for calm either.
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest worries in Thailand, especially social media, because we know that sensationalism works, and so we had a lot of conflicts in Thailand, and people don't really trying to turn towards each other just because of that, really. So the next question here is, what's your recent alternative facts that you have just discovered?
Oh, a recent alternative fact. So, well, I was just sent a link to someone arguing that lockdowns don't prevent the spread of coronavirus. It was quite a detailed argument, and I thought it was quite interesting because when you look at the basic correlation, you could easily fool yourself, right? Because for one thing, have you noticed that all the countries with really bad outbreaks of coronavirus also have lockdowns? So is it because the outbreak of coronavirus causes a lockdown? Or is it because the lockdown causes the coronavirus? So the lockdown skeptics are like, well, look, the lockdown actually made the coronavirus worse. Also because there's a delay, if you lock down, then there's a delay before the cases turn into hospitalizations, turn into deaths. So the deaths would take place maybe a month after the lockdown. So if you're looking for the sort of the time horizon, the deaths come after the lockdown. So people can tie themselves in knots about this. I mean, you have to ask yourself, I mean, it's a respiratory virus, right? I mean, how do you think it spreads? Do you think it spreads over Zoom? I mean, just in terms of this, we're back to Fisher saying, well, maybe the lung cancer causes people to start smoking. Well, maybe, but what really is the plausible mechanism? But what I found really interesting about this was that the argument was very reluctant to be really specific about what they meant by lockdown. And I think that's where the real slippery thing comes in, because you can see a lot of countries that have done a lot of social distancing, but that social distancing hasn't necessarily been compulsory. So in Sweden, for example, only recently did they have lots of mandatory restrictions. For most of 2020, a lot of the social distancing was voluntary, but it was still happening. Like the bars were mostly empty. There was 20% capacity relative to normal on public transport. A lot of people were staying at home. So there's this question of like, well, are you looking at whether the law, like the legal restriction makes a difference, or are you saying social distancing doesn't help? Now, if you tell me actually people social distance anyway, even without a rule, that I can believe. And in fact, there was some good evidence for that. But if you're telling me the social distancing itself doesn't make any difference, then it gets tricky. And by obscuring that distinction, you can make quite a persuasive argument for what is frankly completely absurd.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, I think we'll have time for the last question, but maybe this ties into your 3 C's as well, unless you want to have something else to say about this.
So no. I've said everything I want to say, so I'm happy to answer another question.
All right, okay. What would be the best way to convince someone who has a very strong confirmation bias? In other words, if you have somebody who is just kind of really opposing you and just would not listen, just use emotion all the time, do you have any advice on how to convince them otherwise, or how to get along?
Sure. So I have a little advice. So one of the things you can do is to listen respectfully and ask them to explain. And some of the research I describe in the last few pages of the book about what's sometimes called the illusion of explanatory depth, which I just love, is when you ask people to explain how a flush lavatory works or how a zip fastener works. And they think they can do it, and then when they start trying to do it, they can't. So to say to somebody, just tell me, and don't ask them to justify. Don't ask them to say, cap and trade is a really good way of dealing with climate change. Say instead, just explain to me, what is cap and trade? How does it work? Just talk me through. And when you get people to explain, what tends to happen is that they realize they don't know as much as they thought they did. They get tangled up, and then they start realizing, oh, maybe I shouldn't be so confident. Maybe I should recognize the other side may have a point. And they can talk themselves out. If they really think something crazy, they can actually talk themselves out of their strange views. I don't think there's a guarantee of doing that. But even if you do that, at least you're having a respectful conversation. And they may tell you something. I mean, if they really can explain in detail, well, then you may get smarter. And that's no bad thing. So that's the advice I give. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic way to do this. And actually, the main point I would make is the book is not about how to persuade other people who are wrong. The book is about how not to be wrong yourself. If you can get your own thinking clear, then that is already difficult. And you should be happy if you can get your own thinking clear. To say, oh, and now I need to persuade all the other idiots not to be idiots, just start with yourself. Make yourself not an idiot. And maybe that you should be happy with that. So I can give you a little bit of advice, but the book is about how not to be an idiot yourself. And I think that's a noble aim for all of us.
So the only way to solve the problem is for everybody to read the book and not being idiot themselves.
I endorse this message.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, for all your time and everything. And I'm sure all the audience would love listening to you talk about the book. So if you're interested in the book, and I know that the book is being sold, I guess, in Kinokuniya in Bangkok and so many other places.
We should repeat the title of the book. It's called How to Make the World Add Up. And if you're listening in the US or Canada, it's called The Data Detective. Yeah.
Perfect. And hopefully this interview you can use as well. We'll give the interview to you afterwards as well, just in case the interview is useful to other people who haven't heard about the book yet. So that's all we got time for. Thank you so much, Tim. If you can just stay just one more minute, we'll just after finishing live and that's it.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you everyone. Bye.